to the right place. This is a discussion of the Global South under debt distress. We are at Columbia University in New York City, and we will just be patient for a little thing. And New Yorkers are great at that. They are known worldwide for their patience. So we'll make a display of this and silently count to 10, and then we'll get this party started. Okay, welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion of the Global South under debt distress. My name is Michael Broning. I'm the director of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in New York. It's a pleasure to welcome you to a truly global event. We are being joined by audiences from Buenos Aires to Lusaka, Beirut, and of course here at Columbia University in New York. This event is a co-production by the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung in Buenos Aires and in New York, as well as with the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. And it's part of a global project of FES that asks the question, who pays the bill for the current mess that we are finding ourselves in? And of course, it is part of a week of activities that FES is hosting against the backdrop of the IMF and World Bank annual meetings. So thank you to the participants, thank you to the organizers. Of course, thanks very much to our esteemed panelists today, Martín Guzmán and Joseph Stiglitz. Thank you so much for being here with us live in person. Obviously, the topic of the discussion today couldn't be more timely. I think it's getting more timely as we speak with every minute that passes. So to say, the Global South under debt distress, to say that the world is in turmoil is probably the understatement of the year. And yet, sometimes, in particular in progressive circles, we like to, see crises as opportunities. We like to see the glass as half full as opposed to half empty. And I wonder if that's perhaps, a legacy of Marxist theory, that we think that sort of progress is a given and it's almost inevitable. But the thing is that when you look at history and at historical crises, of course, to hope for the best is quite a gamble. In 1913, Gertrude Stein wrote, "A rose is a rose is a rose." Today, I'm tempted to think that a crisis is a crisis is a crisis. And what makes matters worse today with this crisis that we are finding ourselves in is, of course, that thinking about debt, that the debt crisis today is more complex and it brings in more private lending and more bilateral lending than ever before. And so while progressives and while also some voices in the IMF like to, they are fond of sort of stressing the opportunities in crisis, a look at crises and at debt in the past shows, of course, that progress is only one possible outcome out of a crisis. And it's not always the most realistic outcome. And of course, I'm saying this as a citizen of a country that has its very own experience with, mass and hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and economic turmoil that, of course, leads to political turmoil and catastrophic consequences. So the key of turning crisis into opportunity is obviously, as with almost everything, a question of policy. So how do we, as a social democrat, of course, we like to say what we need is a primacy of politics over, the economy and the market. And we need to make sure that reforms will actually, make things better, which is always not always a given. With regards to the discussion of debt today, the question is, of course, how can we enhance the voices of debtor countries in this debate? How can we make sure that the IMF and some of its policies actually align with its original mission? And how can we bring about IMF programs that actually fix the problems and don't make them worse? So these are obviously difficult questions, and I'm sure I'm happy that I don't have to answer them. But we have an excellent panel that will try to do just that. And with this, it's my pleasure to hand over the microphone to Sydney Maki, who is a Bloomberg News reporter and an editor. And she has covered these issues for a long period of time and is a real expert on these questions. So thank you once again for joining us today in New York and from wherever you are joining the discussion. Feel free to post questions, and we will will try to address them from the audience around the world. And with this, and without further ado, please, Sydney, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to everybody who's joining us today, and a huge thanks to our panel who is here in New York and also joining virtually. I want to say that this conversation will be mostly about sovereign debt and these very complex conversations and relationships that exist between creditors, countries, and multilateral organizations. So without further ado, I would love to introduce here today with us Joseph Stiglitz. He is a Nobel Prize-winning economist and professor at Columbia University, as well as the co-founder of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. He was also previously the chief economist of the World Bank and a former member and chairman of the U.S. President's Council of Economic Affairs. We also have Martín Guzmán, who of course is also an economist, a professor, and the former economy minister of Argentina through July of this year. He is an associate research scholar at Columbia University and leads the Task Force for Debt Restructuring and Sovereign Bankruptcy at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. And I'm also pleased to have two panelists joining us virtually. The first is Viviane Akiki, who is an independent economic journalist and researcher of public policy. She's joining us today from Beirut. And we also have Muchimba Siamachoka, a program manager of social and economic development at the Jesuit Center for Theological Reflection in Lusaka, Zambia. So to help get us started, Joe, I was hoping you could help explain sort of what makes this moment so crucial, especially in the context of sky-high food and fuel prices, huge debt loads, and of course all the complexities surrounding the war in Ukraine and everything else.
Yeah, well, the war in Ukraine happened right after the pandemic, and many countries had excess debt before the pandemic. The pandemic made things so much worse. Incomes went down, exports went down, and needs went up, and so debt increased. Not as much in the emerging markets as in the developed countries. Emerging markets didn't have the choice that developed countries, but it meant that emerging markets and developing countries had a steeper decline in their GDP. I think Argentina was about 10%. And so the pandemic really hurt them very badly. But then, right after that, with all this debt, we had fuel prices going up, food prices going up, and making it all the more difficult for them to meet their needs. And then, because of the inflation, central banks around the world started increasing interest rates. And that had two effects. Much of the debt was denominated in dollars, and the dollar started appreciating, making it more difficult for them to pay. And that, on top of that, higher interest rates. So people use that cliche, it's a perfect storm, but I think this is one of those instances where that description is correct. And everybody who's looked at the matter says that the likelihood that a number of countries will go over the brink is very high. A number of countries have already gone over the brink, and this discussion, by over the brink, I mean have had a real debt crisis, Argentina, Zambia, Lebanon, but they're just the head of the party. There'll be a lot more joining the countries in deep debt distress. So the question is what to do about it. Now, within our countries, debt, many times people have more debt than they can manage. We are discovering within advanced countries, there are all kinds of hidden liabilities that we didn't know about. And the way you handle that is you go bankrupt, and we have a bankruptcy court, you have a way of handling that systematically. We're discovering all kinds of stress UK and the pension funds, gas companies in Germany, they've been nationalized. So there are lots of hidden stresses. The developing countries, the stresses are not so hidden. They're very open, but we don't have good ways of handling them. We don't have a bankruptcy law. We don't, you know, I've been arguing for a very long time that we ought to have an international framework for doing it. The IMF suggested that. Ironically, the Bush administration effectively vetoed it. I chaired an international commission for the UN, and one of our main recommendations was the creation of a framework for doing that. And that was supported by the General Assembly in 2014. And then in 2015, they actually enunciated a set of principles that was overwhelmingly supported. I think there were only 6 countries that opposed. Unfortunately, they were important countries like the United States and the UK. So we don't have a framework for dealing with the problem. And we know from our past experiences that the market doesn't handle these very well. I'm sure we'll talk more about the failures, but there are 2 key issues, or 2 or 3. One of them is the creditors have already gotten a big risk premium. In other words, they get a high return for bearing the risk of lending to an developing country or emerging markets. Now that risk is here.
Right.
But even though they got compensated for bearing the risk, they are deeply unhappy having to bear that risk. So, and they have political influence, and historically, the IMF has played a very big role in bailing them out, but putting the burden on the developing countries for years and years into the future. And that is associated with the problem of what we call in some of the work that we've done here at IPD, too little, too late. Too little debt restructuring, and the debt restructuring occurs too late, and the consequence is, the country suffers for a very long time, and because it's too little, I think more than half the time, there's another debt crisis within 5 years. So we know that historically we have not managed this very well. So that is the setting that we're in. We know about our failures. We know we haven't created a good institutional structure. And when I look around, I think things are even worse right now than these historical experiences, because one of the reasons for the too little too late is there are conflicts among the creditors. And now our creditors have been joined, there are more creditors. China has become a very big creditor.
Yes, bilaterally.
Bilaterally. And each of the creditors agrees on one thing, that the others should pay. Everybody else should take a haircut, except for me. And of course, that deadlock between the creditors means nothing happens, and the burden winds up on the developing country, emerging markets. So the big issue confronting us is, given this flawed institutional structure, over the long run, we ought to do something about the institutional structure. But we won't be able to do that in the short run. And the crisis is coming on us. And so the question, I think, before us is, given what we have, what can we do?
Absolutely. I think that sets the stage really nicely for the conversation today. Martín, as someone who has dealt firsthand with trying to figure out a debt negotiation accord with creditors. Could you talk a little bit about the experience in Argentina and especially the big takeaways that you have from it?
Absolutely, Sydney, thank you. And let me begin by thanking FES for organizing this event, and to all of you for joining here in New York at Columbia Business School or virtually. So Joe described the core issues that a number of economies of countries in the Global South are going to be facing in the very near future. Some of them already facing that distress now. Let me tell you that addressing these problems in the current global financial architecture is going to be highly complex. The debt distress that the world faces now after the series of shocks, COVID-19, and then the war in Ukraine, also happens to occur after decades in which globalization has not worked well for many people around the world. We've seen severe problems of inequality. Well, Joe has written extensively about the perils that inequality entail for the workings of a society. So we are in a situation in which, with the central banks of advanced economies reacting to the problem of inflation in the usual way, as if the problem was a demand shock, what we're going to see with the higher global debt levels clearly is more problems of debt sustainability. And as Joe explained, when creditors lend and lend at a risk premium, they know that there is risk that debt may not be sustainable, and therefore there may be need for restructuring. So there should be no stigma associated, when needed, with sovereign debt restructuring processes. The global economy and the global financial architecture has evolved in a way that will make the restructurings today even more difficult than in the previous decades. Despite the fact that there have been some improvements, like improvements in the language of contracts to deal with some of the coordination problems among creditors that are faced in a sovereign restructuring. I think we need to pay attention to three big issues in the next processes of sovereign restructurings. First, the problem of bargaining between the debtor and the private creditors in a context that is very asymmetric. There are different kinds of asymmetry when we face a negotiation between a debtor and private creditors. First, there are large asymmetries of power, access to networks, access to resources, lobbying capacity. And Argentina, in this sense, is a powerful debtor. Most countries don't have the capacity that Argentina has or had to negotiate with private creditors. Second, there are asymmetries of information. Today we hear calls for transparency, mostly about the debt of African nations with China. But the real issue when it comes to transparency, or the biggest problem, is that debtors know way less about the creditors than what the creditors know about the debtor. The creditors know almost everything about the debtor. At least that was in Argentina's case, that was clear. The creditors knew everything about the debtor. But the debtor knows very little about the creditors. We don't know whether they hold credit default swaps. Therefore, they may have no incentives to cooperate in a restructuring process. We don't even know who holds the debt. The debtor needs to hire an informational agency to identify who are the bondholders. And at the end, the negotiator may just have a very incomplete map of who the negotiator is negotiating with. So that's a very complicated problem that contributes to the deficient outcomes that we've seen over the last few decades, 4 decades at least, as you were describing, this problem of too little and too late, meaning that sovereign restructuring processes start too much to be initiated, and once they happen, the relief that the debtor gets, more often than not, is not enough to restore the sustainability. And we know that when that sustainability is not restored, countries suffer more. There is more social instability, more political instability, more unemployment, more inequality, more poverty. The other problem that I think is crucial in the context of a negotiation between a sovereign nation and private creditors is a political economy problem. You know, the debtor itself is not just like a homogeneous entity with all the incentives well defined. The debtor is a complex system. It includes a political system. There are different players and they have different incentives. Incumbent governments may have the incentives just to resolve the problem in the short term, right? And not the cost of the too little and too late that may arise in the future may not be internalized by incumbent governments. So you have a field in which both sides, the creditors and the debtor, may have incentives for a restructuring that is not deep enough as to restore sustainability. Creditors, in a context of incomplete contracts, may just prefer restructurings that with some probability restore that sustainability, and if later on there needs to be another restructuring, then they may prefer that in order to be able to get most of the surplus in the case that there is some upside later on, a positive shock. Of course, there are efficiency costs to this that need to be internalized, and many times they are not internalized. So this is what we call a Jose Antonio Campo and I used to call this a no system. There's an international no system for sovereign debt restructuring. These processes are based on just bargaining, decentralized bargaining, and in the context of private contracts or contracts between the private sector and the public sector. At the same time, the second big issue that we're going to face is a new myriad of inter-creditor coordination problems, like what Joe was describing. We have a different universe of creditors today. The weight of Paris Club creditors, non-Paris Club creditors, and private creditors has been evolving. China certainly has a bigger weight today. So this will create new issues, and these issues open questions that are not trivial. They're not trivial at all. I had to deal with these issues when I did Argentina's restructuring, and in particular with the negotiations with the Paris Club, in a way that I think made sense. But we will see situations in which there are creditors that do not provide any financing, countries that lost access to financing from certain classes of creditors, and other creditors that still do provide financing. So what's equitable treatment in this context? What if one country, say China, is providing financing to a certain country, but at the same time private creditors or Paris Club creditors are not? Why would a country need to restructure debts with a creditor that still provides financing? If there has to be a comprehensive restructuring, how do we define what equitable treatment would be? It also taking into account that the debts have different maturities, are issued under different currencies, with different risk premia. These are non-trivial questions that we're going to face. And the third big issue is going to be the role of the IMF, but I will leave that for the next round.
Perfect. That is super helpful. And that leads us really nicely into a question I have for Vivian, who is joining us virtually. For Vivian, I was hoping to ask you about Lebanon's experience and what you see as the primary hurdles as the nation works toward the reforms that it needs in order to actually secure funding from the IMF.
Vivian's microphone is off.
Oh, we seem to be having a little bit of tech issues, but
I think that Vivian needs to open her microphone. Her microphone is off.
Vivian, could you try unmuting your microphone one more time? Okay, try one more time. Oh, man. Okay, as we work out a few of these little technical quirks that we're having, that's the fun of having a both virtual and in person. We get to deal with the quirks on both sides of those things. But in the meantime, while Vivian works to hopefully leave and rejoin, if that's correct, and get her microphone working, Muchimba, I'll go to you and ask about Zambia, which just recently began to offer some details about the timing of a potential debt restructuring. Quite recently, it was said that the first quarter of next year could be the first that we have some kind of early debt restructuring accord in Zambia. Muchimba, could you tell us about Zambia's progress, especially as a country that is among the first to attempt to restructure using the G20's common framework?
Thank you so much for that question, Sydney. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, you sound great.
Great. So with Zambia, of course, the common framework itself is a new application, a new system that we have applied for. And when you look at the three countries so far, Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia, Zambia has made quite substantive progress. We've gotten onto an IMF extended credit facility program, but negotiation, and just to speak to a point that Joseph earlier mentioned, is negotiation. It's just that. We don't know what the outturn will be. And so far, from what we have observed, even as civil society here in Zambia, the process will look to be lengthy, in that is the current architecture of the debt restructuring process. Zambia, quite all right, may have gotten onto the IMF program, but we don't know what the outturn will be. Currently, you know that we did miss the principal payment for one of our Euro bonds, and that will be one that is prioritized in terms of discussions around negotiation. So just to emphasize, the current framework, the process does seem timely, and remember, if we are the first nation perhaps to make this much progress under the G20 common framework, then we become a lesson to so many other countries. So it's neither here nor there in terms of how soon the restructuring process will take. And just to emphasize, during these periods of restructure, if the process is lengthy, what does that then mean for that debtor country? For a developing country, you will note that financial access is hampered in an extent. If you are in debt distress, perhaps you're facing downgrades with your credit rating. So it becomes quite hard to also pursue growth in an era where you're also trying to restructure when you don't know what the outturn will be.
Absolutely. And I'm curious to ask if, by using the common framework, the process has been different than in other more traditional restructuring approaches.
Yes, because you see, this common framework, and at the time that it was birthed, was to respond to different emerging issues. I believe the context has been laid very well by the previous speakers. So we are coming from a pandemic. We borrowed before the pandemic. Clearly, the world did not anticipate the Russia-Ukraine crisis and how much it would affect different issues around global inflation, rising food prices, etc. So it's happening in a slightly different context. I will take you to the Debt Sustainability Initiative, the relief that was provided to countries. For Zambia, that was quite a small drop in the ocean because then our debt portfolio was really quite unsustainable. So as it is right now, from the time that we defaulted, in 2020, November 2020, we've been pursuing the IMF program that we only got this year in 2022 August. So you look at that time period. And when you look at the restructuring process as it is, if we do sign the MOU with the creditor committee by December, then we have the prospects of seeing how it will pan out. So I would say it's quite different because then the predictability is not so certain, especially for a country like Zambia. And perhaps maybe just to emphasize on that point, you see a lot of secrecy in terms of the provision of information. So right now, as a civil society entity, we are reliant on the information that government provides. So then it becomes very hard in terms of trying to speculate where we are or where we foresee ourselves. But we must commend the Zambian government that has been very proactive compared to the previous regime in terms of information provision. So it becomes quite key. And this is the point that my team did raise in terms of, we know the creditors know more about the debtor countries and we have less information about them. And just to mention, Zambia has over 44 creditors with different personalities, for lack of a better term.
Thank you for that. So, Joe, what type of possible reforms of the international finance architecture do you see as necessary? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, can I make a few comments first on some of the things that were said before, and very, very quickly. One of the things I didn't mention in describing the context is that we've had low interest rates, close to zero interest rates, since 2008. And that has meant an encouragement for people to take on more debt. And, you know, there's a kind of irrationality in markets. They think that you're going to remain at a zero interest rate, a low interest rate forever. And of course, forever is not forever.
Right.
And the end of forever happened in 2022.
Right.
And so we are now in the world of increasing and possibly high interest rates in a context where countries have taken on too much debt and where the low interest rates led lenders, particularly in the private sector, to push money onto developing countries beyond what they should have done. The second point I just want to make very briefly is I think an illustration of a market, of a failure of our economic framework is that central banks are raising interest rates as if the source of the problem was excess demand. Higher interest rates is not going to result in more oil, more food. It's not going to solve the supply chain problems. In fact, it's going to make some of these problems even worse because the investment that you might have needed to alleviate the supply chain problems or these other problems are going to be more expensive. So it's counterproductive in this and a number of other ways. But central bankers have in their DNA almost that when you see inflation, you raise interest rates. No, don't think, just do. And the media, I don't want to criticize the media too much, but one of the problems with the media is they egg it on. They say, oh, you were late at the game, you know, will you have the nerve to continue doing the wrong thing more and more? So it's a little bit like medieval bloodletters. You know, bloodletting was never a good idea. But the theory was you let blood, and when the patient didn't recover, what did the medieval bloodletters do? They say, we haven't done enough. And so they let more blood until most of the patients died, and occasionally there was a miracle, and the people recovered. And then they would cite the miracle as the evidence that bloodletting was the right medicine. So our central banks are really medieval bloodletters, and I think particularly Federal Reserve, and it's, as I talked before, is really creating problems around the world, just like it did under Volcker in 1980, leading to the Latin American debt crisis, where almost every Latin American country went into debt distress. The third thing I wanted to mention is the complexity that Martin emphasized in the domestic political economy. In some cases, the political leaders who are engaged in the debt restructuring get political contributions from the creditors. And so rather than working really for the country, they're working half for the creditor side. So there's really some complexity in this political economy, you know, and pressure is put from people closely related to the creditors. So in a democracy, with a lack of transparency, this is a real problem. And the fourth thing in the comment about the common framework, I just want to point out that initiatives like this, an earlier initiative in the pandemic was called the DSI, the Debt Sustainability Initiative. And one of the striking things was the private sector said, we're not interested.
Right.
And these are voluntary frameworks.
Right.
And the private sector has not been very helpful. Not a surprise, their main interest is money.
Right.
Not helping the developing countries, not worrying about the fact that people are going to die. People are in the middle of the pandemic. Can you believe it? In the middle of the pandemic, basically they said it's more important for me to get money than for you to help your people not to die. So I'm not optimistic that we're going to be able to get all the creditors in the room and get a humane, reasonable solution. Now go back. What was your question?
Well, so the question goes back to these complex relationships that you were mentioning, right? Because of course in the 80s, early 90s, it was just bank loans. So there were fewer people in the room to argue with. And now you have pension funds, you have Wall Street banks, you have this very wide sort of room full of different creditors with different perspectives in mind. And so my question is, where do we go from here? Is there some kind of financial architecture that could come forward and be helpful in these types of restructurings?
I think there is. I mean, and that was what we outlined in the report for the UN in 2010. And the UN enunciated the principles, agreed on them in 2015. So we know basically what to do. You know, to me, the answer is so obvious. Every country has bankruptcy laws to address the issue of what happens when there is excess debt beyond what people can pay. These events happen. Nobody likes them, but they are part of life, you might say. And you know that you cannot solve those problems with contracts. You need a public framework with a set of principles. International debt, cross-border debt, is more complex than domestic debt, and yet we have no framework. And to me, it seemed, you know, foolhardy to think that you could write contracts with, we call them collective action clauses, that would resolve this difficulty. If you could have done that, why would we have domestic bankruptcy courts? We know we can't do it. And yet many people hope that we could. I don't think they really believed it. I think it's the law of the jungle. The private sector likes there not being a framework. Why? Because this reflects what Martin was saying. They have more power. And when there's more power, they win, and the countries in distress lose. And so it's not, you know, you asked the question, is there a way of doing it? I think the answer is yes. To get there, we'll have to overcome the interest of the creditors. It was the U.S., for instance, that opposed having a kind of framework back in the early years of this century. But when I say it was the U.S., it wasn't the American people who opposed it. I think if you asked most American people, do you want a humane solution? Do you care about the developing countries? Is it in our national interest that there be a crisis? It's clear. The answer is clear. These were interests of our special interest on Wall Street in the financial community, and they triumphed over American interest. So the political economy problems that we mentioned in the debtor countries are also true in the creditor countries. But in each side, they're not working in the interest of the ordinary people in the developing countries and emerging markets.
Interesting. Perfect. So I want to ask you about the IMF and Argentina's experience, but I believe that Vivian's audio is now working. So I'd love to go back to Vivian and ask about Lebanon's experience with debt restructuring. Of course, it's been a lengthy process so far, but it would be great to hear about that process so far.
Hello from Beirut. regarding the negotiations that Lebanon is handling with the IMF, it doesn't seem that it is much different from what is happening in several countries, in several debtor countries, or the global south. The journey of negotiations with the IMF have started in May 2020, and then with the former government, but due to disagreements within the local oligarchy on how the losses will be identified and who bears these losses, these negotiations stopped until the early 2021, i.e. after 3 years since the first crisis first started, which really started in 2016 with the financial architecture and the Ponzi scheme that was already in place. These negotiations relaunched in 2022 after losing a lot of time and making the Lebanese people believe that something is happening. Indeed, ironically, there was an agreement among the personnel 1 month before the parliamentarian elections in Lebanon. Of course, after the elections, we did not go back, of course, to square zero, but there was negotiations with the IMF, but the deadline in September 2022 for identifying the preconditions which were agreed at the personnel levels were not met, or even the measures that were undertaken were a distortion of what was agreed. Of course, I do not want to defend the IMF or blame or point the finger at the local interests, but the journey of negotiations since 2020 until now seems that it's more of like a ball game, a football game. They're giving each other the ball, passing the ball to each other. So the different moves that have been exchanged are an attempt to rescue the local system. And just like the other colleagues said, that this game is one of the expertise of the IMF, and this has started since the start of the crisis in Lebanon, so before 2019, but it didn't show until 2019. It hadn't shown to everyone. I'm sorry, I cannot hear Vivian. So it was clear that the different shuffling of moves has been continuing. So in 2019, the national budget was $17 billion. The budget in 2022 is just over $1 billion. So it's barely $1 billion. And this is just a presentation of the different problems that have been happening in the community. And we have been having problems that we haven't seen since 40 years. Like we have new cases of cholera, we have the inability to buy fuel, to operate pumps, to treat water in order to have clean water to homes, in addition to so many problems that we're facing at the social and economic levels and the recession in the economy. This is, in short, the journey of negotiations with the IMF that had not reached productive outcomes, but from 2020 till the plan of 2022, we see that the criteria is shrinking, which would really serve the interests of the local oligarchy at the expense of the interests of the people. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that. And it actually goes really nicely into the question I wanted to ask you next, Martin, which is going back to the renegotiation of Argentina's loan with the IMF and the experience of Argentina and the IMF within the past few years. You know, what lessons can other debtor countries take from that in terms of how they can approach their own negotiations with creditors?
Thank you, Sydney. So let me first begin by reacting to actually endorsing one of the comments that Joe made about the path to resolving or creating a system that works for sovereign debt restructuring. Certainly there is no way in which just improvements to the contractual language can provide solutions to the problems we face. Mm-hmm. You know, some amendments to the contracts may help. They enhance collective action clauses that ICMA endorsed in 2014. You know, they help, but they fall far short from resolving the kind of coordination problems that we are describing here. Actually, there is a vacuum. The fact that there is no international mechanism for the resolution of sovereign debt crisis means that when a country is in a situation of arrears, in a situation of default with the private creditors, there's a 9% compensatory rate that gets applied while the country is in default. Now, today, the inflation rate...
US New York bonds.
Issue under New York law.
Right.
But about 70% of the bonds are issued under New York law. And it doesn't change much under other jurisdictions, you know, London or etc. So when a municipality files for bankruptcy, you stop paying that interest rate. So the debtor doesn't pay 9% because it's under the bankruptcy proceedings. So it's a U.S. Treasury bonds rate that applies to the debts that are in arrears. But there is nothing similar for a sovereign, and that's one of the several problems that contribute to the too little and too late problem. In 2014, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution for initiating a process for the creation of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. In 2015, the United Nations General Assembly adopted another resolution that included 9 principles that should be the basis of an international mechanism, but virtually nothing has happened since then. And this is the problem of geopolitics. There were 6 countries that opposed to this initiative at the UN, but those 6 countries include the most powerful creditor nations.
Right.
And that's also important to understand the dynamic between a nation and the IMF. So now let me go to your question on the IMF. Argentina's negotiations with the IMF were unusual by design. You know, first, Argentina in 2018 resorted again to the IMF. In 2005, Argentina had paid in full to the IMF, and that was a gain in terms of sovereignty for the country. But in 2018, after massive borrowing with Wall Street creditors, the previous administration resorted again to the IMF for a historic loan, record loan, $57 billion, out of which $45 billion were disbursed. Out of those $45 billion, almost half were used to finance a capital flight. And more than half of those $45 billion were used to pay debt that was in a position of unsustainability to private creditors. And this aggravated the crisis in Argentina. So it led to more unemployment, a further contraction in economic activity. In 2020, we initiated the process for resolving the debt crisis of the country, and there were 2 big parts to the debt spectrum that had to be addressed. The debt with the private creditors and the debt with the IMF. Argentina didn't have any capital amortization payment and with the IMF until September 2021, but we had capital payments coming due with the private creditors in 2020. So first we did the restructuring with the private creditors. The IMF did play a role that was unusual. It produced a technical note on debt sustainability, which, unlike almost every DSA that we've seen from the IMF in the last 4 decades or so, was founded on the right theory and on the right empirics, and that meant that there had to be a large haircut, however you measure it. Creditors used to refer to net present value. This is another discussion, but in any case, somehow there had to be a significant relief. This DSA helped in a number of ways. For instance, it helped us to deal with the domestic political economy problem, because it wasn't just the negotiator saying we need significant relief. It was also the IMF saying the country needs significant relief. So it did help. But somehow creditors complained a lot about this DSA. You know, we hadn't seen creditors complaining too much about the DSAs from the last previous decades that were conducive to the too, or contributing to the too little and too late problem. But they did complain a lot about this one. For a proper DSA to anchor expectations during the negotiations, it's also important that the IMF shareholders provide legitimacy to it. And with some shareholders that was the case, but with others, or in particular with one, we didn't think that was the case. So actually creditors, you know, where they were showing off saying, no, this large country, they tell us that we should not pay attention to this DSA. For future restructurings, first, the DSA has to be well-founded, and second, it has to have legitimacy conditional on being well-funded. Okay. Then we had the negotiation with the IMF, and the deal we achieved was also quite uncommon in terms of its characteristics. It's a deal that did not involve the standard fiscal austerity policies in the context of recession. Actually, there was an expansion of real spending in the fiscal path that had been projected. And it didn't involve any loss of rights for workers or pensioners. Of course, you know, there was shared responsibility here. It wasn't just that the Argentina's government had borrowed from the IMF, but also the IMF had decided to give this massive loan to the country. But there are certain aspects of the IMF that clearly need to be revised, and especially more in the current context if we want the IMF to play a stabilizing role rather than a destabilizing role in the global economy. Number one, the surcharges policy of the IMF. The IMF imposes extra interest to borrowers when they borrow above certain threshold of their quota. So if a borrower borrows more than 187.5% of the quota, the IMF charges 200 extra basis points. And
explain the quota.
Quota is the quota that each country has at the IMF as a shareholder. The US has the largest quota at the IMF. Say Argentina has a quota that it will be about, I don't want to get it wrong, but about 4.5 billion. So Argentina borrowed 10 times its quota, meaning that it had to pay a lot of surcharges according to this policy. Okay, and the advocates of this policy have been saying that, you know, this is to deal with moral hazard. We don't want countries to borrow too much from the IMF or stay too long with the IMF. But come on, what country wants to stay for long with the IMF? Have we seen that around the world? And second, what moral hazard are we talking about in the context of a pandemic and then a war? Right. So countries are in situations of distress, not because of moral hazard situation.
Besides, they can't borrow unless the IMF approves. It's not like you have a blank.
Exactly. So the IMF has the ability.
It's such a nonsense theory.
And now this policy will make even more damage than before for a number of reasons. First, because the crisis at the international level it's becoming larger, it's deeper. So there will be more countries that will need to borrow more. And second, what's going on? The Fed is increasing the rate, the central banks of the advanced economies are increasing the rate, and the lending rate of the IMF is linked to the SDR rate, the rate on the special drawing rights. This rate increases when the central banks of the countries that have reserve currencies increase the rate, meaning that the basic rate of the IMF is already becoming more expensive. So on top of that, you add surcharges. For instance, the basic rate of the IMF was close to zero a couple of years ago, and today it's above 2%. So you already have an increase in the basic rate. Right. The IMF is saying, you know, we use the surcharges also for building precautionary balances, and they use it for operational expenses. But now, that's not really an argument because the basic rate is higher. So first, why should the countries in crisis pay for the operational expenses? Second, they already get more income from the basic rate. Okay. The interesting thing is that these surcharges that countries pay do not appear at the IMF website. If you look at the IMF website to see what countries are paying, you're not going to see this information. And this is not just an isolated issue. The IMF is not a transparent institution. We, for instance, don't know what the IMF does with this money. Is the IMF, for instance, investing this money in bonds from developing economies and emerging economies, or is it investing this money in, I don't know, in other assets, taking money from countries in crisis to invest in assets from other countries? We just don't know. So there are a number of issues that will need to be addressed in terms of the IMF policies and the IMF functioning as an institution if it wants to play a stabilizing role in the current global juncture.
And it's an interesting point you bring up about the IMF's history with austerity measures, that it'll work with countries in order to end up lending money. And I'd love to ask a question to Muchimba about that, and we'll go to Vivian after. But in countries like Zambia and Lebanon, are there conversations sort of on the ground, individuals talking about the type of austerity that could come from an IMF deal? And of course, supporters of the IMF say that the austerity has changed quite a bit over the past decade, and the conditionalities aren't quite as severe as they once were. So I'm curious, you know, especially in the context of Zambia, how are we seeing that so far?
Thank you so much, Sydney, for that question. So, of course, the fund itself has also come outright to say that they're not the IMF of the past in as far as the structural adjustment programs are concerned. Because with the structural adjustment programs, and this is testament for many African countries, what we saw with such austerity was around wage freezes. There wasn't much spending, especially on social sector spending, which is quite critical. So I'll speak to Zambia's context in terms of the extended credit facility program that we are on right now. But before I go to the austerity, perhaps maybe one issue that I would like to also highlight in this conversation is around the aspect of governance. What we have seen as a country for the first time is a law that was repealed in terms of allowing the minister to borrow in his own capacity, that is the Minister of Finance. So we now have a Public Debt Management Act that speaks to National Assembly oversight, which is quite progressive. And I would say our national budget for the year 2023 was presented on the 30th of September. And for the first time, we do have an annual borrowing plan that will be presented before Parliament. However, some of the other conditionalities that I would like to speak to in terms of austerity have to do with the elimination of the fuel subsidy, as well as tax policy changes that may see the value-added tax go up. This is in terms of trying to broaden the tax base. But we also have cost-reflective tariffs around electricity. So when we look at fuel, electricity, those are really at the heart of the economy. And any shift with fuel, for instance, you tend to note that it triggers the cost of doing business in Zambia. So even with this particular measure that was implemented at the end of the last month, we do anticipate that the cost of living will go higher. So then it brings in the question in terms of if we are trying to protect the very vulnerable people in these developing nations, perhaps they didn't even know what their governments actually negotiated for. They were not consulted when this government borrows, but then they have to bear the burden in terms of what debt does, or how debt actually manifests itself in a human face. And for Zambia, really what we have seen in the last decade or so is the depreciation of the kwacha. We are a landlocked country, so largely import-based. So with the debt crisis and how it has grown, that has really affected the cost of doing business, the cost of importing different products. So I would say with the current context, these austerity measures or conditionalities, if I could call them, do raise concern, because then issues such as fuel, like I have mentioned, electricity, those really spark the entire economy. I don't think it can protect any particular individual. So we are hoping if the cost reflectiveness is what is being given as a reason for pursuit, that should really be something that translates to the Zambian people. Ideally, that's who we want to protect.
Thank you. And really the same question to Vivian, especially in a situation like the one that Lebanon is currently in, which has been dragging on for quite some time already. How does this translate down to people in Lebanon and the will to get a solution figured out?
It goes without saying that the IMF has been criticized a lot after 2008. So the fund tried to lure people into thinking that there are changes in the way the fund is intervening in countries. But if we take into account the Lebanese situation, we can notice clearly that the principles implemented by the IMF haven't changed even after 2008. So things are still the same. Although the IMF tries from time to time to try and give a good conduct licenses, if we could say so, to the people and the government. In certain cases, the value-added tax was increased, and this has placed more burden on people. There were a lifting of subsidies. There was a trend towards privatization. There is a certain agenda implemented by the IMF. These are the same principles: lifting subsidies, changing pension funds, and adding VAT. So things are still the same ever since the 1990s. The Lebanon hasn't signed yet any plan with the IMF, any program with the IMF, but this is the rules in general. Regarding austerity measures, Lebanon is already implementing austerity measures, even though the contract hasn't been signed yet with the IMF. The budget was around 17 billion, and now in 2022, it's around 1 billion only. The budget in Lebanon is around $1 billion only for this year. So a huge drop. Yes, some are ideologically against the interference of IMF in the internal affairs, but here I'm not here to talk about the ideological aspect, but rather about the techniques implemented by the IMF. And I will be stressing on 4 points that will show that whether an IMF plan is adapted or not, nothing will change. So nothing will change. Why? Because the IMF projects are implemented in emergency cases. They are very short-term plans or programs. Countries have across 3 to 5 years to implement certain measures. So very short-term measures called reforms as by the IMF, and practically on the ground nothing changes. The majority of countries that have signed agreements with the IMF haven't succeeded in getting out of their crisis. We can take the example of Argentina, Jordan, Sri Lanka, Egypt, and many other countries. I think that this short-term measure is not really useful. Another thing, the IMF has always been seeking to protect capitals across the world and many countries across the world. And the IMF is always fulfilling the same function ever since the 1940s until the 1970s. It used to lend money to wealthier countries. After the 1970s and up until 2008, we have noticed a change, a structural reform. We have now a new liberal agenda that is being implemented with the liberal markets. And ever since 2008, the IMF doesn't have any specific job. It only does what it knows, what it has always done, which is implementing austerity measures and asking countries to implement austerity measures. Many reports, including an UNCTAD report, warns against austerity. So the World Bank as well has issued a report about poverty, and it showed that ever since poverty started being tracked in the world, 2020 was definitely the year during which the most increase in poverty occurred. Moving to another point, important point as well regarding the IMF, regarding mainly the negotiators. So who is representing truly who? We find that oligarchy is the negotiator, and it is mainly the interest of capitalists that is being guaranteed and protected, and therefore it's not really about the interest of people. At least in Lebanon, it's not really, they don't really have the interest of the Lebanese people in mind, but rather the interest of the wealthiest or those who have the capitals. We know that the IMF has very strict conditions that are associated with any debt, with any loan. In the Lebanese case, I don't think that this loan is going to help Lebanon. Lebanon is anyway implementing austerity measures even without an IMF plan. Lebanon is already negotiating with the IMF over the national capitals and the national resources. And I think that things are getting worse ever since the past 3 years. So again, it's not only about an IMF program. It's about finding new out-of-the-box ideas, in Lebanon at least, to try and find a solution to the crisis. All the countries should give a new meaning to politics, to policies, should think out of the box, have a new balance of powers, if I could say so that the interest of people prevails over the oligarchy or the few, as we say. I think that it's all about how to give meaning again to politics, to policies, and this is how countries can truly start thinking out of the box and face any IMF program and any interest defended by the IMF, since the IMF is one of the arms, if I could say so, of the world order, the world system.
Right.
Can I
Thank
make
you.
a couple comments?
Please, and then right after that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A portion.
Okay.
So if anybody who is joining virtually or in the room has a quick question, go ahead and type it into the comments or run it over to this corner of the room. All right.
So the first thing, I do think the IMF at the leadership level has changed enormously, and that began back in more than a decade ago with Strauss-Kahn. Where, you know, for the first time they had good economic leadership who understood economics much better than a lot of the previous leaders had. And he spoke a lot about inequality, and he said, you know, why is the IMF concerned about inequality? Because he said inequality has an effect on macroeconomic performance, and our concern is macro, and we have to therefore be concerned about inequality. And I think the current leadership is showing the same kind of understanding. she's leading a focus on climate change. Why is climate change part of the IMF mandate? Some people have been criticizing. I think it should be part of their mandate. Why? Because climate change is a threat through financial stability. And again, one of the IMF's real mandates is financial macro stability. And if we don't manage climate, we're going to have some instability. But having said all that, these are large organizations. We talked about the political economy in the United States. We talked about the political economy in the debtor countries. There's political economy problems inside the IMF. And so the leadership may say one thing, and when it comes to the operational of what is going on, I don't know the details in Lebanon, but or in Zambia, but we know that in some of these cases, the people who are on the ground for the IMF don't always get all the message from the top. So that's a broad issue in all large organizations. The second point I wanted to make very, very briefly is to echo what Martin said about doing better debt sustainability analyses, DSAs. When I was at the World Bank, one of the things I found, I won't say it's amusing, but interesting, was that when the IMF was doing forecasts, when countries were coming in for their general strategy, the IMF was always very pessimistic. You need to have higher taxes if your budget is going to be balanced. But when it came into debt analysis, they were amazingly optimistic. They said, oh, the country is going to do very well. It can pay back huge amounts of money. And I said, look, your forecast ought to be consistent. You can't have an optimistic one for one case and a pessimistic one. And then we were used to have these situations where you would negotiate forecasts. Now I would scratch your head. I mean, as an economist, you don't negotiate. You make a forecast. It's a scientific thing. No. You negotiate a forecast. And the point of this is that because historically the IMF was the creditor collection agency, I mean, that was its historical role. We ought to be clear about that. It wanted optimistic forecasts so that there would be less of a debt write-down. And they say, oh, the country can do it in a sustainable way. Now, this is where there's an important link between the IMF moving away from austerity and debt sustainability analyses. At least the better people at the IMF, including the people at the top, understand that if you have austerity, the economy is weaker. And if the economy is weaker, you can't pay back. So austerity is linked to debt sustainability analysis. And that's why Argentina was really breaking ground, because they allowed it to have a non-austere policy, which enabled the country to grow, and it has been growing. And I just hope that model is used elsewhere and give countries who are going through debt distress, not put them down the tube, but actually enable them to grow again.
So I do want to pass along a question that we got from one of our viewers, which was, Georgieva has suggested that the fund might begin lending into arrears more than previously, especially in cases of creditor recalcitrance. Is this credible, and is it a good or a bad idea?
Martin, do you want to begin?
Arrears with the IMF?
I believe so.
That's what. So, I mean, the IMF is money is taxpayers' money, and that's why the IMF is supposed to have preferred creditor status. It means that the IMF is senior to the other creditors. It's first in line to get paid. There are rarely arrears with the IMF. However, the what we were discussing before precisely shows that the IMF is making a business out of its profit. The surcharges policy is hardly consistent with the preferred creditor status of the IMF. Let me pick up on a point that Joe made related to this. I had to deal with the IMF for some time. I mean, I was the Minister of Economy for Argentina for almost 3 years. So I had to deal with the IMF on a weekly basis, and I did see a positive and proactive leadership at the fund, but most times the geopolitics gets on the way. So there is certainly a problem of rigidity within the institution, but there is another issue, which is the geopolitics. So at the end, the IMF is an institution that responds to the interests that are manifested by the largest shareholders. So you see situations in which the leadership may have a view on what to do with surcharges, but then it's not possible to take that to an actual change. Or you have a view on what role the IMF should play in a global economy that is suffering from climate change, in which climate, it's not just a development issue, it's also today a macroeconomic issue, because countries that do not adapt their structures of production will have problems to compete internationally in some time from now, so they will have balance of payment problems. So the IMF wants to do something about it. But then what gets done at the end falls again short of what the original idea is. So this is certainly a complex institution. Good leadership helps, but it's not enough.
Can I say one thing? Martin was talking about the creditor countries. And the largest creditor country is the United States. I just want to give you a little flavor of even the political economy problem in the United States. Historically, one of the problems has been that the U.S. Treasury, I put it somewhat jokingly, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Wall Street. That's maybe putting it too strongly, but the financial markets have a very strong influence in Wall Street, on Treasury. At the same time, the United States has very strong, broader geopolitical interest. We want stability in Latin America. And so there are forces, say, in the groups in the National Security Council, in our foreign policy establishment, that don't want chaos. Treasury, reflecting Wall Street, sometimes says, well, that's another problem. Our job is to make sure that that our Wall Street firms get repaid. And so you get a clear conflict within even the U.S. government about what should be the right policies towards debt restructuring. And I think that's where the kind of broad framework that we talked about earlier at the UN, where you have a set of principles that you can elevate this a little bit beyond these special interests.
I have another audience question for Martin. Do you think Argentina will need to restructure their debt again before 2027?
Well, that's an easy question, right? So at the end, debt sustainability is a broad concept, and it depends on future performances that are affected by a large number of variables. I'm no longer the Minister of Economy, but we were working to make the economy more stable, make the economy more dynamic, increase the capacity of production of Argentina such that it can have a performance of a sustainable economic growth with social inclusion. But I want to also, again, pick up on a very important point that Joe made regarding the global financial architecture and the role of the fund. And I also witnessed this, or I experienced this as the Minister of Economy for Argentina. The IMF policies and the characteristics of a sovereign debt restructuring with private creditors have direct effects on the real economy, on the capacity that the country has to implement policies for productive development. But somehow, you don't see the interest of, say, the Trade Department or the Energy Department of the different shareholders of the IMF represented at the IMF board. You see the views of the Treasury departments of the world. And that means that sometimes you may have a situation in which the development of the real economy would benefit from, a deeper restructuring or a change in some of the IMF policies, but the financial sector does not benefit from it, and the voice of the financial sector is overrepresented. So you get outcomes that are biased in favor of financial interest and against the real interest, the real economy interest.
Right. So we do have one question in the audience here, and then we will have to wrap up pretty soon. So if we can keep the answers brief as we tie up, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jay Pocklington here with the Young Scholars Initiative. Question of, the issue seems to be borrowing in dollars and needing to have IMF loans for the dollar loans. So the very simple question at hand is there space going forward, or theoretically and practically, to issue sovereign debt in local currency under local law? Would there be ample space for the development needs for their debt restructuring in any scenario going forward, or are we locked into a world where we have to borrow at scale from the global north in dollars?
Well, let me begin, and then there are big advantages for countries borrowing in their own currencies. And the obvious big advantage is you're not subjected to foreign exchange risk. But there's another advantage, that the legal framework is one that is more amenable to developing countries and emerging markets and not captured by financial markets in the north. So there are a lot of good reasons. Over the last 20 years, there's been a big movement towards borrowing in local currency. So the answer is clearly that it can happen more than it's happened in the past. For it really to work, there has to be more savings in the domestic markets. And one of the reasons of the success, I think, of East Asia, the East Asia miracle, was that they generated a lot of domestic savings. They didn't have to borrow abroad. It was only when pressure came from the advanced countries, including the United States, for East Asia to open up its capital market that they started borrowing from abroad. And guess what happened? Then we had the East Asia financial crisis of 1997.
I can complement Joe's response. Certainly, we want countries to develop their own domestic capital markets to avoid the currency mismatches that are associated with borrowing in foreign currency. When we did our restructuring in Argentina in 2020, there were, I would say, the large majority of analysts were saying that we should do a deeper restructuring for the debt under Argentine law, because otherwise we were going to have problems again in the U.S. courts, as Argentina had from 2001 to 2016. To me, that made no sense, because that would have meant that in the future, no one would want to borrow under Argentine or lend under Argentine law, either in foreign currency or in domestic currency, but certainly under Argentine law. So what we did was to give equitable treatment to the debt under the different jurisdictions, precisely under the premise that we had to do what it takes, to strengthen the domestic capital markets. We've seen a wave of what happened during the last 15, 20 years, that there's been a massive growth of private liquidity. And all the quantitative easing was also contributing to an increase in liquidity all over the world, and that liquidity was searching for yield everywhere. And that's how we saw a large growth of debts denominated in foreign currency in large parts of the world. And now we have to deal with that.
Perfect. And that puts us right on time to welcome Julia for closing remarks. I could ask you both 100 more questions, but it would take 2 weeks. So thank you so much for all of your great answers today. And for the panelists who joined us virtually as well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Sydney. It's my turn now to offer some closing remarks. I will follow these notes that I have been taking to stay on time. First, I would like to start by taking up a few ideas from this rich and interesting discussion. First, I want to reinforce the critical nature of the current state in which the countries of the Global South find themselves, pressured by indebtedness. It is necessary to further deepen the dialogue and actions that allow us to see the debt crisis from an international perspective without losing sight of how these macroeconomic problems affect our society and their day-to-day lives. This is why the discussion presented today is crucial, and I would like to reinforce some highlights of what we heard from our panelists. First, and there are very little ideas. So first I want to take some highlights from Professor Stiglitz. He said that historically the IMF has had a role in bailing out creditors, and the burden has been placed on developing countries, and there is very little debt restructuring, and the restructuring is done very, very late. That this world problem is exploding in the emergency markets, and we need to do something in the short term, and we wonder about what we can do, and I know that we have a lot of ideas here. Then Martín Guzmán gave us some points to think and for the transformations that may come. He talked about the need to discuss of what happens around the bargaining power between debtors and private creditors, that we have to work in the big asymmetries of information because debtors know almost nothing about creditors and not vice versa, and that we have to think of the debaters as a complex actors with different interests, not as an homogeneous unit. I want to say too that Martin has highlighted the overcharging policy as a big deal that we have to work in it, and that this kind of policy can function as a destabilization policy or something. Viviana Kiki underlined the crisis that Lebanon is going through and the role that IMF could have there, deepening some of the structural problems. She also highlights that the new IMF is the same IMF because its principles are the same. She said even that Lebanon is willing to implement austerity policies before being under a program. And Mauchimba Siamoka highlighted the lack of information and transparency of civil society, and this is something that Martín Guzmán said too in other aspects. She also highlights the harsh consequence of debt on growth in Zambia, relation it with the austerity policies. Then I will like, and I think together with the IPD, I would like to underline our interest to push forward this kind of discussion. FEE supports different initiatives in countries facing serious structural problems of indebtedness, and our interest here is to highlight a gender and human rights perspective in this. In broader framework of the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank this week, we face an increasing interest from civil society and other political actors to take their part in the reformulation of the international financial architecture. Many voices from the Global South have made an effort to show the links between the burden of debt weight and countries as an obstacle to development, as a macroeconomic problem that transcends the fiscal issue and the impact of the greater precariousness of people's lives. We join the debate and highlight the existence of these links. We need to review the institutions. We need to hear the voices of those who are directly and indirectly affected by the debt crisis, because, as in the word of a great Latin American thinker, the more we pay, the more we owe, and the less we have. Finally, I would like to thank you for participating today. Foremost, I would like to thank to our panelists, to Joseph Stiglitz, to Martín Guzmán, to Muchimba Siamakoka and Viviana Kiki. They have given us their valuable time to talk to us and continue to deepen points of view and arguments that support the evident need for institutional transformation of the international finance. Of course, I would like to thank Sydney Maki, who has done an excellent job today, and I will keep only you a minute more, but also you can see a few people on stage. This event is the final result of the effort and articulation of many more, which I would like to thank. The colleagues of the office, the office and the colleagues of FES New York, FES Argentina, FES MENA, and FES Zambia, especially for the representative of this office, Benia Blanque, Michael Boring, Thomas Klaas, Armin Heisman, and Sarah Gardner, and also the colleagues Sarah Burke, Lennart Tinklar, Jennifer Land, Ronia Schiffer, and the communication team, Eugenia, Mariela Nasma, also the interpreters that are doing their work, to IPD, especially Gabriela Plump, who has been thoughtful and active, and of course to Columbia Business School for their hospitality and kindness in receiving us. Thank you very much to all of you, and I hope to meet you again, continue these discussions.